David Renné. He has served as president since 2010 of the International Solar Energy Society, ISES for short, but this is a good ISIS. And his PhD was long before that. He's been at NREL since 91, retired in 2012, and since retirement from NREL, where he managed the solar resource assessment activities, he's become a consultant to Clean Power Research, a small U.S. company that develops resource assessment and analytical software tools. He also has been a consultant to many organizations on solar resource assessment, including the World Bank's International Renewable Energy Agency, the Asian Development Bank, Battelle, Columbus Laboratories, and others. And he acts as associate editor of the Solar Energy Journal in the field of solar resource assessment. So with that, I want you to all welcome Dr. David Renné.
Thank you. I guess I don't need that, right? All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I checked our solar output from our brand new solar system at home, and it was not very much today, so picked a good day to come inside to listen to a long talk. I'm not normally used to talking for an hour. Hopefully I'm not going to spend that much time up here, but if you get impatient, please tell me to hurry along, and I'll try to move this further.
You've got as much time as you want.
Okay, thanks. So as Steve mentioned, I've been president of the International Solar Energy Society since 2010. I keep getting reelected. I'm trying not to become president for life, but it's beginning to look ominously like that might happen. But I've guaranteed Paulette, who's the secretary of the International Solar Energy Society, that my next term will definitely be my last. So what I'm going to talk about tonight... People may not know that Paulette is your wife. Paulette is my wife. Okay, I wasn't going to disclose that, but... So I'm going to just give us a few brief comments about what ISES is all about, and then I'm going to talk about the case for a fully renewable energy system, and then focus specifically on growth and opportunities in the field of solar energy, and then close with a few comments about renewables working together to achieve the goal. And so this is my one solar resource slide. I thought I had to get one in there anyway. I don't do much in the solar resource field anymore, but let me just quickly discuss what the International Solar Energy Society is. It was founded back in 1954. Actually, it was founded, had a different name, and John asked me to sign the history books, and I'm sure you spend late every night reading them from cover to cover. But they actually do have some pretty interesting information in there about how we all formed, and we all means ACES as well as ISIS. The original organization had a different name, can never remember what it is, ASFE or something like that. 1954 in Phoenix, and they had a conference at that time. Larry Kazmersky, oh, by the way, I'm feeling very overdressed tonight, but I had to wear a Larry Kazmersky tie, so this is his latest model, and I think Paulette has his equivalent scarf. But anyway, the solar design. Kazmersky designs these ties. He's been doing them every year since, I don't know, back in the early 2000s, and hopefully he'll keep doing them. But anyway, the society, there was an organization started back in 1954, the same year that Bell Labs patented the first solar cell, and later on, that society became known as the Solar Energy Society. And then in 1970, they organized a joint conference in Melbourne with an Australian Solar Energy Society. And that's when ISIS formed, and Australia and the American Solar Energy Society became the first two sections of ISIS in 1970. And since that time, about 65 countries around the world have organized sections of ISES. Some of those are still active. ISES, of course, is one of the most active of all of our sections. We have strong activity in Europe and in India and China as well. So we still have a pretty good global reach. We'd like to see more in Africa, but in South America, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But what is it we're doing today? I mean, currently we're embracing the feasibility of a 100% renewable energy system for everybody used efficiently and wisely. And we have a number of strategic partnerships that we're working with. We're a very academically oriented society. Our memberships are primarily researchers and institutions in academia, but we're trying to connect that technical information to a variety of strategic partnerships around the world to especially give information about the technologies to the financial and policy communities. So what ISES specifically does is we publish a solar energy journal. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. We organize a congress every 2 years and a conference in the alternative years in Europe. Our next congress is going to be in Abu Dhabi at the end of next month. We have a monthly webinar series, which has become very popular, and a newsletter that's either monthly or bi-monthly, depending upon our staff situation and headquarters. And our headquarters, by the way, is in Freiburg, Germany. And I write a blog called A Sunburst when we don't do a newsletter. And we provide, many of our members provide contributions to key global reports. And I'll show some examples of that here in a few minutes. And then we have a very active social and communications, social media communications program using YouTube and LinkedIn and as well. And I just wanted to highlight a few of our partnerships. ISES has just recently became a member of the board of the Global Solar Council, which is an association pulling together solar associations from all over the world. We've also been on the steering committee of REN 21, which produces a global status report. We're involved with the Go 100% Renewable Energy platform. It used to be called a campaign, but now it's a platform. We were on the executive committee of the Solar Heating and Cooling Program. We're very heavily involved with IRENA and with the Energy Access Practitioner Network at the UN Foundation. So these are just some of the examples. Plus, we have a lot of participation in regional conferences. Paulette and I have both been involved in the Renewable Cities Conference up at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And we organize events at Intersolar San Francisco. In fact, we were organizing the American Solar Energy Society's conference there last year, and we do an event there as well on other years. So we have a very active outreach program trying to connect our technologies with the decision-making community. Okay, so now let me plunge into my talk here. This is a very busy slide. I just wanted to highlight two things on this slide. A lot of times you hear about energy sources and energy consumption. And so I want to make sure that we're clear that a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how we consume energy and where the sources for that energy are coming from. This is a sort of a complicated diagram showing total energy flows globally, but I'm going to be focusing primarily on the energy use side of things. And the supply of our energy use comes, as you can see, primarily from nuclear, coal, and oil. Those are still the very dominant energy sources worldwide. If you look in the middle of this diagram, you'll see hydro, which is blue, and nuclear, which is orange, is kind of holding steady over this time period. And the very narrowest band, let me see if this works. Is there a pointer? Yeah, there it is, somewhere. Well, it doesn't point on the screen. Anyway, the very narrow band is the renewable energy contribution to our world energy supply. Still very small, but growing in significance and certainly in importance worldwide. So I don't want to get into a detailed climate discussion. I know you're all very familiar with all the climate issues, but this is one way for me to kind of articulate the reason why we really need to target a 100% renewable energy future. To limit climate change to no more than 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, our cumulative carbon dioxide emissions cannot go beyond another 1,900 gigatons of carbon dioxide from now on. We're already about 1,900 gigatons in terms of what we've put into the atmosphere already. So we've already gone almost halfway to reaching that 2-degree critical milestone, which the IPCC research community believes very strongly is sort of a tipping point for where we can really start having catastrophic events if we go much beyond that level. Here's a way of looking at where we are and where we need to be in order to achieve this. Currently, we are producing roughly 35 gigatons of carbon dioxide on an annual basis. And if we just do a business as usual scenario, that'll likely go up to about 42 gigatons by the year 2030. If we take the Paris Agreement commitments that were made by all the countries worldwide, that would get us back down to about where we are today, about 35 gigatons of carbon dioxide. If we go be much more aggressive and deploy aggressive and significant energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, we can we can probably drop that down to about 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide. But if we want to go to, remain to within 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, which is what the Paris Agreement is targeting, we have to be at zero carbon emissions by the year 2050, or roughly by mid-century, to get to that point. And the IPCC has been looking at 4 different emission scenarios, and the one I want to highlight is one that's called, they're called the representative concentration pathways, and 2.6 represents the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for that particular scenario. And that's the only one that can really, from a scientific perspective, keep us at 2 degrees centigrade. And that's a very rapid, or it's a peak, and then a very rapid decline in carbon emissions, similar to what you saw in the last figure, where it peaks in about the year, in roughly 15 to 20 years from now, 2030 to 2040. And then it declines very rapidly so that by the last half of this century, it is at zero. So this is a very dramatic transformation of our energy supply that we're going to have to be experiencing in order to get to that point. Here's another way of looking at it. This is just the temperature's response to the cumulative total carbon dioxide emissions. Again, here's where we are now, close to 1 degree centigrade warming already since pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreements will put us up there around 3.5 degrees if we just follow what all the countries committed to in Paris in 2015. And as you can see, again, I'm not sure where the button is, but if you look up here, at the end of the blue line, that's where the RCP 2.6. Anyway, so this is just another way of looking at the challenge that's facing us in terms of trying to achieve the climate goals that were set out under the Paris Agreement. So based on this, a solution is, as we've talked about over and over again, is a global target of a 100% renewable energy supply. And that's for all end-use energy consumption, power, transport, and heat. Those are the 3 major end-use energy sectors that we're looking at. Currently, the power sector is only about 20% of our total end-use supply. The large proportion, or the large majority of our end-use energy is in the heating sector, and that's more so in the developing world than it is in developed countries, but because a lot of the heat in developed countries is now coming from electricity. But then also there's a significant amount of non-electrical energy being used by the transport sector. So to get to a 100% target, we have to think about all renewable energy technologies working together. And we also need to think about a significant transformation of our energy system, not just a transition of our energy system, but a transformation. But that transformation is already occurring, and which is the good news to be reporting. And many people entering into the energy arena now in their careers have quite a different perspective as to how our future energy should be gained than those of us who worked in it for many years and are now retiring. So decarbonizing only the power sector is clearly going to be insufficient to meet the goals that I showed earlier. And even then, I have to emphasize that energy represents about 2/3 of total carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And so even if we do decarbonize the energy supply completely, we still have a third of the carbon dioxide still coming out of land use activities and that, non-energy related activities. So that's the challenge. Now let me show kind of the status of where we are. A lot of the figures I'm going to show from here on are from the Global Status Report. How many of you are familiar with the REN 21 Global Status Report? It's freely available online. ISES has been working very closely with them, and so a lot of members from ISES contribute to it. But it's every year they publish, about in June or so, they publish this rather thick document online and it's free, that really summarizes where we are today in all renewable energy sectors. And so I encourage you to, if you're interested in seeing what's happening on a global level, this is really an excellent document to extract from. And so here's one analysis coming out of the most recent report, which was published back in June of this year. And it shows that all renewables are, the total energy consumption is met by roughly 19% renewable energy supply. But of that 19%, 9% is traditional biomass, and only 10% is what we would call modern renewables. And modern renewables would mean modern use of biomass, like liquid biomass or geothermal technology, solar heat, hydropower, wind, and biofuels for transport. So roughly 10% of our total energy supply is being met by what we would call modern renewables. And a much smaller portion of that is being met by wind and solar, which is what I think most of us are involved with here. Just by comparison, the UN's Sustainable Energy for All goals that were issued by Ban Ki-moon, who, by the way, announced this when he was here in Golden on a visit with NREL about 6 years ago. But one of the three major goals for Sustainable Energy for All is to have a 36% renewable energy by the year 2030. And with, at the same time, universal energy access. In other words, there would be no populations left that do not have access to modern, reliable energy sources. So that's his goal, and you can see that we're more than halfway to that goal, but you can also, if you recall back to the earlier slides I had, that's still going to be pretty insufficient to achieve the climate challenges that we're facing. Here's another way of looking at that last chart. This is just a different way of presenting the information. And again, you can see less than 1/5 of the total energy consumption is met by renewable energy technologies. And again, you can see how roughly half of that is being met by traditional biomass and the other half by what we call modern renewables. And by the way, I put all the conversions, or some of the conversions along the top. One of the challenges I find when I'm going through all these different reports is how agencies like to use their own unique numbers or units. And so this one came out of the IEA, and they like to use hectajoules. IRENA uses kilowatt hours. So you always have to figure out how to convert. And then if you go to the oil company reports, they always have million tons of oil equivalent, and they're in units. So now here's the renewable share of global electricity production. Remember, that's only 20% of our total energy consumption, but renewables are doing much better in this area. Almost 25% of our renewable electricity is now coming from what we would call modern renewables, and much of that is hydropower. More than half is hydropower, but you can see wind and biopower and solar are in there, and to some extent ocean thermal, CSP, and geothermal power are also contributing to that. So the renewable energy share in the power sector is growing on a year-by-year basis, whereas the total renewable energy share for all energy consumption, unfortunately, is not changing very much on a year-to-year basis since these global status reports have started coming out. So now I'll talk more specifically about solar PV and capacity levels that are being achieved in solar installations globally. Again, this is information coming out of the global status report, and I also have some figures here from Solar Power Europe that also does similar kinds of analysis. But you can see that there's been a remarkable growth. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Remarkable growth has occurred in photovoltaics, so that worldwide, so that we are now at roughly 303 gigawatts of installed capacity at the end of last year. And last year we added about 75 gigawatts. The expectations are that this year we'll probably add another 100 gigawatts, so this number will probably be close to 400 by the end of this calendar year. And you can see that the largest capacity additions last year were in China. China was by far and away the biggest growth market, and the U.S. was second last year. There's been significant growth here in the U.S., thanks in part to the ITCs being continued. And then Japan, largely a lot of this is in response to Fukushima, but Japan has really accelerated its solar programs over the last few years. They were a very strong nuclear-powered country, but there's been a very strong movement to move away from nuclear power completely in Japan since the Fukushima incident. So here's a couple of other ways of looking at it. So as I said before, the Solar Power Europe came up with a number of 306.5 gigawatts. Global status report shows 303. We're 1% different. I think that's in the noise level. But the real interesting numbers are the amount of additions occurring on a year-over-year basis, and they're at about 33% growth per year. So, and the technology categories where this growth is occurring, we see that it's still crystalline silicon is still the workhorse of the industry. Multi-crystalline has really dominated, but there is monocrystalline silicon technology that's growing. It's lower cost and becoming more and more efficient. But in any case, crystalline silicon technologies are by far the dominant, followed by thin film technologies. And last year, the production of thin film technologies increased, but overall, the markets are actually going down because of the crystalline silicon markets being so favorable. And then the concentrating photovoltaic market continues to struggle. It's having a hard time getting its costs down and getting its reliability to the point where it can become a commercial success. So let's just take a look at a couple of the others. The other two solar technologies are solar thermal, low temperature solar thermal, and concentrating solar power, which is high temperature to produce electricity. So for low temperature solar thermal, of course, this is a technology that's been around for many, many years. We're finding that there's still growth globally, but not as much as there used to be. The global capacity relative to PV is still higher in terms of an energy level, but the growth is still positive, but 21 gigawatt thermal is quite a bit lower than it was in previous years. And the main reason for that is by far the largest market for solar thermal and solar water heating systems is in China. And China's had an economic slowdown, and they had policies that they've removed and to encourage the installation of solar thermal technology. So that market has decreased quite substantially. And along with that, the markets in Europe and the United States are also getting smaller. They are growing, however, in South America and in parts of Africa. And then concentrating solar power had very little change last year, but there are some projects in the pipeline, so this number could suddenly change quite significantly this year. And we're just under 5 gigawatts global capacity at the end of last year for concentrating solar power. And then just by comparison, I wanted to put the wind slide up here. 54 gigawatts of wind power was added globally last year, so a little bit more than solar. But actually a little bit less than solar, excuse me. And solar was actually the biggest renewable energy addition of all renewable technologies last year globally. But of course, wind is still very strong, and overall it has almost 500 gigawatts of installed capacity. So, as I was saying before, 100% renewable energy requires all renewables working together in all end-use sectors. Well, how does a technology like renewable energy grow and prosper? I always like to use a three-legged stool as an example, because I think there's three major components to any successful business, and solar has certainly been experiencing this. First of all, you have to have really reliable, bankable technology, something that you can put on your house or put on the grid and know that it's going to work reliably for you for many years with very low maintenance costs. The second key element of all this is access to capital, and especially private capital. And actually, there's a lot of capital out there. There's a lot of money available. Investors are looking for places to put their money. And if you have a good technology that's reliable, the investor will be attracted to that, and that's what's happening. And then the third piece is favorable and reliable policies and targets. And I like to circle this one because, to me, this is the one that's most problematic for us now. I think the technologies are doing very well. There's still room for more R&D. There's still room for improvements. As I mentioned, there's a lot of capital out there, a lot of pension funds, a lot of investors looking places to park their money because interest rates are so low. And but the policy situation seems to be quite unstable right now and changing quite a bit, not just in the U.S., but in many other places around the world, but certainly in the U.S. And let's take a look at what's happening here a little bit. This is also out of the Global Status Report. It's a little hard to understand why they say that there are state and provincial policy measures and not national policies in the U.S. and Canada, because we do have a national policy. We still have policies in place by the federal government that gives financial benefit and tax credits to technologies, but those are small relative to what the states are doing. So, and this is also true in Canada, and you can't see it very well, but New Zealand also has a lot of local level incentives taking place that's really driving it. But what's happening is that the policy, you'll see these flags up here, and those are countries that are holding renewable energy only tenders. And that's where one of the biggest changes is occurring. More and more countries are going to tenders and getting bids on who can provide the lowest cost electricity. And some of them are renewables only, some of them renewables are competing with traditional technologies. And all of these tenders are helping push the markets in many of these countries, more so than some of the policies are. For example, the feed-in tariffs that were so popular in Europe 10 years ago are really going down and no longer being as effective. And in fact, they're disincentivizing a lot of solar installations in Europe. So this is why I say the market or the policy landscape is really kind of shifting on us. There are some countries that have added to their policies, like Argentina and Australia. They've had policies for a long time, but they're trying to strengthen those policies. And then there's a few countries like Bolivia, and not too many, but we're just now are starting to create policies at a national level. And then there's still, especially in Africa, many countries that don't have any policies at all. And this is for the heating sector, and it's the same picture there. There's not as many countries that have specific solar heating policies. China does, and it's one of the very few countries that does have it. South Africa has very strong renewable heat policies, but not necessarily solar. But the result is that you see a strong solar heating market there. Brazil has policies at their state level, and the state with the U.S. we don't have any national solar heat policies at all. And then another policy issue, I wasn't sure where to put this in, but I think it's very important. I know ISES is quite concerned about this trend that we're seeing. As I don't know how many of you are familiar with this injury lawsuit. Okay, almost everybody is. What happened is that Suniva, which I think has gone bankrupt, and Sunworld, which may also be going bankrupt, sued to stop the importing of low-cost solar panels, primarily from China. I think it's almost exclusively from China when they launched the lawsuit. And that's been working its way through the courts. The ITC, the International Trade Commission, which is a 4-person commission established by the president, just ruled last week that, yes, Suniva and Sunworld were injured by these low-cost panels coming into the country, and as a result, they're considering now imposing tariffs on these panels. Well, what that's going to do, I mean, you can understand the idea of trying to protect your domestic market, but there is not much of a domestic manufacturing market for solar panels. So the result of the tariffs will be to raise the price of solar technologies and probably discourage a lot of solar installations, and especially solar domestic installations. And the concern is that thousands of U.S. jobs could disappear if these tariffs are imposed. And so this is one example of what I'm concerned about is the uneven playing field. And I think fundamentally I support the concept of free trade, but I want it to be on a level playing field. And I think this is one area where there's some real concerns because the decision will be made by Trump in early next year. And I was just at hearing a talk by Abigail, I'm sorry, I don't remember her last name, the new head of SEIA, and she's quite concerned that Trump will actually sign the new tariffs and cause a lot of damage to the solar industry in the U.S. as a result, just because of his stance that he's taking against especially the Chinese unfair trade practices that he seems to exist. And so this is a policy dilemma and an issue that's going forward that's going to be a problem, not just for the U.S., but I think Europe is going to start experiencing this. The European community is already having similar issues that the U.S. is having. And I don't have a solution to it. We're happy to have a discussion about it afterwards if you'd like. So then let me go to the investment side of it. Now, globally, the investments dropped off quite a bit last year. There's 2 major reasons for that. I mean, there's actually more reasons, but the 2 that I'm aware of, not being an economist, are that the price of technology is dropping. So you can get the same amount of gigawatt capacity for much less investment now than you could even just last year. And the other thing, though, is that not so much on the solar side, but on some of the other renewable energy sides, the markets in the U.S. and China and in places in Europe as well have gotten weak over the last few years. So the investments have actually dropped, even though we're still seeing dramatic growth in solar and wind technologies. And you can see that these colors, the lower bars, are for different parts of the world, and investments are kind of going down across the board, not only in developed but also in developing countries at various rates. And that's expected to continue into this year as well. But as prices are coming down, that's not necessarily a completely bad thing. It's not necessarily an indication that the industry is getting weaker. And here you can see them by technologies, and by far and away, solar and wind are getting the majority of the investment of the renewable energy investment globally. The other technologies are pretty small. And again, you can see that it's roughly equal between developing and developed countries. And what these lowering costs of these technologies are doing is bringing the price of installed systems down. This is a chart from that IRENA published, but I think it was from an analysis from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And it shows the drop of the installed capacity in dollars per kilowatt of solar farm technologies, in other words, central station technologies, not rooftop solar. And you can see that by in 2009, it was almost $5,000 per kilowatt. And within 5 years to 2014, it dropped by, or 2015 rather, it dropped by half, or more than half. So the significant portion of that drop has been associated with the panels, which is the orange bar at the bottom of the bars. And but the other balance of systems are also coming down, and costs in general are coming down for all components of a solar system. The projections going forward, if you look at 2017, this is expected to continue to go down, although not so much with the panels. I think Bloomberg New Energy Finance sees possibly bottoming out of panel costs in the next couple of years. But the other balance of system costs, the inverters, the mounting racks, and all the other equipment, as well as the site preparation costs and permitting costs, are all expected to come down and to less than $1,000 per kilowatt, or $1 per watt. Here's another way to look at the competitiveness of photovoltaics. If you look at these bars, this is from another analysis from Solar Power Europe. Residential PV tends to be higher cost per watt than commercial or large scale or grid-tied utility scale PV. Utility scale PV has the lowest costs. And you can see that especially utility scale PV is competitive now with combined cycle gas technologies, and certainly with coal and nuclear. And even some of the commercial and some of the residential areas costs are coming down to the point where they're competitive with these traditional technologies. That's a very important tipping point for solar, because once utilities and people who are purchasing power see that these solar technologies and wind technologies are actually a better deal for them than a traditional coal or nuclear power plant, they're going to start buying power from these plants, even if the power is variable. They're going to opt out for those plants. And so if you look at this chart, the utilities are paying less and less under their power purchase agreements for solar power, for solar and wind both. There's a lot of spread in these curves, but if you look across the chart, starting from 2009, wind, of course, has been much lower than solar for many, many years, but as you can see, as we get out to present day, solar is catching up with wind in terms of low costs. And you can see that these power purchase agreements are really dropping in price and are now becoming, the wind and solar are becoming the favorable technologies in many cases for purchasing new power supply. As we go forward, what do we expect to happen over the next 5 years or so? Again, Solar Power Europe has looked at high scenario and low scenario projections, and the solid line you see is kind of the middle scenario. But if you see, you can see that even this year, especially under the high scenario, they expect more than 100 gigawatts of solar to be installed, so it's quite an increase over last year. The next 2 years, this year and next year, are roughly the same, but then it continues to go up to over 160 kilowatts or gigawatts of installed capacity. And I think they all agree that unless there's some major change in world markets, the high scenario is a more realistic one than the low scenario. So very optimistic outlook for future markets. And this is the same information plotted as a cumulative total. And what you can see is that within 5 years, we're expected to have close to 1 terawatt of installed solar PV capacity worldwide. This is an interesting chart because I know that there's some controversy about this assumption, but Solar Power Europe sees a rooftop solar market really growing dramatically over the next few years. It's been kind of stable over the last several years, primarily because of the feed-in tariff policies that have been changing. But they expect to see the rooftop solar market to grow relative to the utility scale market. The utility scale market will remain strong, but more or less stable, whereas the rooftop solar market will grow. I haven't really studied the details of that analysis, but I do know, for example, in India, where they have what they call the solar mission, which is 100 gigawatts of installed capacity by the year 2022, and 40 gigawatts of that is is expected to be rooftop solar. So they expect to have a strong rooftop solar market in India, although right now they don't really have much in the way of policies to support that. So this is just one estimate from Solar Power Europe. Okay, so challenges and opportunities. Now let's talk about what they are in the power sector. How many of you have seen this duck curve? You've probably all seen it so much you don't want to see it again, but I'm going to show it anyway. Basically with the duck curve, this is developed, conceptualized by California independent system operators a few years ago. And basically what it says in a market like California, where you have a strong daytime solar resource, and you have a strong incentive to put rooftop solar in your house, the net load that the utility has to meet, which is the actual load minus the solar coming into their system, which they don't necessarily see because it's behind the meter, but the net load is going to become smaller and smaller in the middle of the day in California as more and more penetration occurs, and that's what causes the belly of the duck in the middle of the day. But of course the sun eventually goes down, and in the evening load is actually expecting to increase over the next few years. And so the load that the utility has to meet in the evening is actually even getting higher. So what that means is that there's a significant ramp that the utility faces every day in the late afternoon when the sun goes down, but then the domestic usage goes up. And that's sort of the issue that the ISO has really been struggling with in terms of the solar incentive programs in California for the last few years. They don't want to disincentivize solar, but they know they have to have ways of meeting this rapid ramp. And what that means is that the utility system has to be flexible. It has to be able to bring in power sources from another place, or have storage, or have some mechanism in place to meet that significant ramp that occurs. So these are the challenges that our utilities are facing in order to have that flexibility. And effective and geographic balancing strategies for California anyway is one of their best options, because they don't have a lot of in-state production of traditional energy. It's most of it's solar. So a lot of their energy comes in from other states. So, and that's called balancing, when they can quickly get power, excess energy from another location to support their grid. Storage capabilities is going to become a very important issue. It is an important issue. It's going to become more and more important. A lot of controversy around whether that's going to end up costing us more than just sticking with the original utility structure. But I think as more variable renewable energy goes into the grid, solar storage technologies are going to become a very key technology. Resource forecasting, the area that I've been involved in, is really helping a lot, so that utilities have some advanced warning as to when the variable renewable energy is going to change its output quickly, and they can make plans to meet that change. Obviously, it's going to drive more efficiency in generation and transmission. Distributed energy is going to really help that a lot. And incorporation of distributed energy, and even microgrids and community power systems, which can act like microgrids. Smart grids and load management analysis. A lot of data analytics are being looked at to see how to better handle this fluctuating load. And energy pricing strategies, which California is already doing. And if you have a solar house in California and you understand the energy prices as how they change from throughout the day, you can be pretty clever and learn how to make use of the solar to charge your electric vehicle or heat up your water with a heat pump, versus just putting it back out into the grid. Because as you know, in Colorado anyway, the excess solar that we put into the grid from our house doesn't give us a whole lot of cash. But if you're using that excess solar to charge your electric vehicle, or you make it some other important use, of course it's much more valuable that way. And then the whole concept, the whole area of technology and integration standards is a big issue right now for utilities. So now here's another issue. I didn't know whether to put this in the policy discussion or here, but as you know, how many of you are familiar with the staff report that DOE just recently published? Joe, for sure. Yeah. pretty controversial when Rick Perry became Secretary of Energy, and he comes from a state that's one of the most successful places in the world for incorporating large amounts of renewable energy into the system. He came into the Department of Energy feeling like variable renewable energy is a threat to the grid and a threat to our national security. And so he launched a study to try to figure out how much of a threat is that, and should we actually be, or should not we, but should the Trump administration be actually going out to states and ordering them to lower their targets, their renewable energy targets. And so that study was launched in April and was just published last month. And I felt, when I saw it, I felt it was a very political issue, but I think the report is actually kind of interesting. It actually kind of coalesces a lot of important information that sort of diffuses the whole issue that the administration was concerned about in the first place. What's happening is that baseload plants, mainly coal plants and some nuclear plants, are retiring quite rapidly. And so the concern is that as baseload goes down, we're not going to be able to meet our baseload requirements. It's going to have to come from some other sources. And renewable energy is not reliable enough to achieve that. But in reality, what's occurring here is that system reliability, resiliency, and flexibility are actually being enhanced through the renewable energy programs that we've had over the last few years. And that a number of system operating changes are occurring, including storage. So the report actually refutes the idea that renewable energy is harmful to the grid. They do acknowledge that further regulatory procedures and R&D in general is going to be necessary, especially R&D on grid integration, transmission, and distribution going forward. So there's an important outcome of the study that there needs to be a favorable regulatory environment for variable renewable energy because it's coming into the grid and nobody's going to stop it, and that there still needs to be a strong R&D program to support this. So these are some of the key findings. This is primarily in the area of the threat to the baseload situation, and that but they make it very clear that evolving market conditions are needed to accommodate variable renewable energy, and that by the variable renewable energy that's already out there is actually helping to enhance the flexibility of the generation system. So it's actually a good thing for the utilities. And that what's important, an important outcome I thought of this study was that the society really provides or really values the attributes of renewable electricity. And they want to see more of it. They want to see it even go beyond those compensated by the current design of the wholesale market. So in other words, in short, what that says is that the citizenry, the public acceptance of renewable energy is very, very strong. And they pointed out the biggest contributor to coal and nuclear plant retirement has been the use of natural gas and not renewable energy. They do acknowledge that the variable renewable energy has negatively impacted the economics of baseload plants, but the point is that whatever the negative impacts are being compensated for, more than compensated for, by these other attributes in their conclusion. So I thought that was a good outcome. At least that's the way I interpret it. Again, it was a very controversial report. As I say, storage will be key. These are some of the major storage technologies that utilities are looking at. And of course, batteries and flywheels, and to some extent compressed air storage and pumped hydro are already being looked at quite seriously by utility systems. Now, for the other end-use technologies, transport sector, the integration of electric vehicles into the grid is really a critical step, and the ability for the grid to take advantage of the storage capacity that's out there is going to be really important going forward because, and we've seen the growth of electric vehicle usage is really accelerating. I think it's going beyond what anybody even imagined just 5 years ago. It's going to require improved battery technology. I think as we start seeing more and more shift to driverless vehicles and even reduced car ownership by private individuals and more ownership by Uber and Lyft and companies that do ride sharing is going to affect the whole transportation picture, especially if those vehicles are electric vehicles. And then there's still the idea of second generation biofuels to provide liquid fuel for cars, and hydrogen fuel cell technology is still being looked at. And my sense, though, is that the electric vehicle will probably become the dominant transport of the future. Hydrogen and fuel cells and second generation biofuels, to me, will probably be more of a transitional approach. And then on the renewable heat side, what we're seeing in many places around the world is that it's cheaper to produce heat from electricity than it is from a solar power from a solar panel. And it's not good news for the solar water heating installers, certainly in the U.S. and elsewhere. Europe is also being hit hard, and China is now beginning to get hit hard. But that's another trend that I see happening in the future. Using renewable or getting your heat from electricity rather than from direct conversion of solar energy. And also that when you do have solar water heating out there, that impacts the load that the utility needs to meet. And so there has to be better ways of integrating the load coming from renewable heat into the power sector. There's still room for a lot of technology improvements and cost reduction. The cost of solar water heating systems has not gone down at the same rate that PV systems has gone. And I think the big future markets for solar heat will be in the area of district heating, large-scale district heating, and low-temperature industrial process heat. There's a lot of companies that are looking for ways to get low-temperature heat that they still see as the solar water heating systems are the advantage for that approach. Well, and then, yes, electrification of the transport and heating sectors is obviously growing relative to the other end-use sectors. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that the workforce is really getting a benefit from the renewable energy sector. Roughly a third of the workforce is working on solar photovoltaic and solar heat. And another third is working on wind energy, and the other technologies cover the rest. But close to 10 million people, 10 million jobs worldwide in this sector, and likely to continue to grow. And relatively flat right now, but as you can see, the trend is upward. And this is a very important argument to make to the decision makers, the policy makers. And then peak oil is a myth. I just put this up here because I got this out of a BP statistical review of the world, and they show the relative breakdown of proven reserves. In 1995, the middle is 2005, and the right is 2015. And the relative distribution of the reserves isn't changing too much. Actually, the Middle East is getting a bit smaller. But the total proven reserves that's out there is growing in size. So peak oil, I think, conceptually still exists as a concept, but I think in terms of actually being faced with peak oil, that's a myth. And that's actually a problem for the renewable energy industry, because it gives the oil companies motivation to continue to push very hard for that technology to continue. So to close, the prospects for 100% renewables. In order, as I said before, as I was making the case earlier, to achieve the Paris climate mitigation goals, all energy sector carbon emissions must be eliminated by mid-century. Even that's not going to solve the problem completely, but that's one way to get towards solving the problem, one very important way. But even if we take climate challenges off the table, and this, why else do we want to have renewable energy? Well, we've already seen strong evidence that it creates good business. We look at the 10 million jobs that have been created by it. It creates energy access to people who have been unserved in the past. It provides energy security because you're using local resources and you're not relying on foreign countries to bring in your energy supply. And we see strong focus on issues like community power and local power supply as a driver for renewable energy technologies. So 100% renewables, certainly we feel within ISES, it's technically feasible, and there have been a lot of studies out there that have laid out scenarios for achieving 100% renewables. And technology, I don't think that technology is going to be the barrier for this. I think it's going to be the political will that's needed. And I'm glad to hear about the Sierra Club ready for 100. Paulette and I have met with Jody in the past and seen the work that she's doing, and that's really important to raise this awareness about this possibility. But we do need political will at all levels, local and national and globally. And we must make sure that the technologies are truly attractive to investors, that they're bankable, that investors can see they're going to get a return on their money that's very favorable to them. And that'll free up a lot of capital when that's made known. And then, as I said, even with short-term oil price drops, renewables are now a cost-competitive choice for power in many places around the world. But as I showed in that previous slide, the extraction industry is heavily financed and continues to identify new reserves, and so that keeps motivating them to go forward with their political attacks against growing the renewable energy industry. But I think fundamentally we must leave remaining fossil fuel resources in the ground for high value use by future generations. Why do we want to burn it all up now when future generations are going to need this for many other high value purposes? So that's my talk. Just to call your attention to the fact that our next Solar World Congress is going to be in Abu Dhabi at the end of next month. Paulette and I will both be there. Maybe some of you will come over and join us there. It'll be a very interesting conference with a lot of global leaders coming in to talk about some of these very issues that I just described. Thank you.
So you'd mentioned about the growth in solar and wind. If I remember correctly, they totaled out to about a terawatt, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Currently. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, what is the current consumption of energy in terawatts?
It's about, let's see, you can actually determine it from that one chart I had for power.
Right.
It's roughly, I think it's still less than 10%. I'd have to go back and...
Right. So as a ballpark, we're looking at something like 10 terawatts, and we're looking at, by the end of this year, or the last current data we have, give or take about 1 terawatt that either is or will be installed.
Yeah.
All right.
Roughly.
Have you gone so far as to project growth rates and say at what point we could actually power the planet under current rates, or any of that kind of?
You mean power the planet with wind and solar only?
Or whatever you've got, meaning you've got a collection of things that are growing at rates that can be projected under current growth rates, optimistic ones, pessimistic ones, the usual game. Has that been worked forward?
Yes, well, there have been a number of studies, and we actually had some key people come to our Intersolar San Francisco session in June talking about it. Mark Jacobson from Stanford is looking at it. Dan Kamen, has been looking at it. Fraunhofer Institute's looking at it. They all see pathways to get to 100%. Based on various assumptions on what the consumption is going to look like, and also which technologies are going to be winners and losers. Some of them, I have to admit, some of them do look at nuclear as the base load supply. Right. But so in other words, it has been looked at. There have been scenarios that show that we can get there by 2080, 2050, 2080. Greenpeace shows a very aggressive scenario that they look at. IEA tends to be more conservative, and they don't show that kind of growth, although they are changing.
Do we have a projection for current rates as they are? Meaning if politics and other market forces don't change anything for better or worse, as they are now?
Yeah, as they are now,
when we'll cross over?
Yeah, for example, on the solar side, I don't have examples for wind, but the solar side that I showed for the next 5 years shows pretty dramatic growth increases still, at least another 75 to 100 gigawatts per year for solar PV.
Okay.
And I think wind may not be quite as high, but it's probably not too far from that. So.
Well, I mean, as a back of the envelope sort of quickie thing, if we're adding 100 gigs of solar a year, right, and we need to get up to 10 terawatts, that's 100 years.
Yeah.
we don't have time for that, if I understand
No, we don't.
correctly.
That's a very important point, is that the path that we're on now is not going to get us to where we need to be. We
Right.
have to take a much more aggressive approach to this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. So my question gets back to the third leg of your stool, the capital leg, and let me illustrate with an example. The company, the power sector of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, has been gobbling up utilities from Iowa to California. And Warren Buffett is really big on wind. And Warren Buffett is not known for losing money. So here's an example of big money coming into the wind sector. Over in Europe, there's Royal Dutch Shell, which of course is an extraction company, and they've just gone into the UK to sell electricity in the UK. So my question is, do you see, what's your perspective on that kind of capital coming in? And this kind of follows up on the preceding question, how do we get there fast? You need large amounts of capital. And so from your vantage point, which is worldwide, where do you see these amounts of capital coming from, or do you think it's necessary for the kind of growth that's needed to get to 6 to 10 terawatts?
Well, I think this is not an area that I'm a real expert in, but I think certainly some of the oil companies, some of the more progressive oil companies, see the future more clearly than others do. And they're willing to start investing into these alternative energies. Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco, for example, they're very secretive about what they're doing, but they have a lot of money. They have by far and away some of the most capital of any organization in the world. And they're seeing renewable energy as a very viable business option for the future. And so I think some oil companies, are going to be winners and losers, but some oil companies really have gotten it already and are beginning to make that move. Beyond the oil companies, though, there's huge amounts of investment capital out there in pension funds and other businesses, the technology companies, and they're looking for ways to invest that money too. And especially like the technology companies, they see renewable energy as a logical place to invest in because it's going to, renewable energy, the variable renewable energy is going to require very good technology in order for it to work properly in the grid. But yeah, so there's some oil companies are going to help spur some of this development, but it's not going to be only from them. It's going to come from many other sources.
Hello? Okay, thanks. And just to follow up on some of the oil companies paying attention, I hope you all saw that San Francisco and Oakland sued most of the oil companies last week to try to say you have to pay for climate mitigation. If you're causing sea level rise, you're going to have to pay for some of that and some of the, disinformation that Exxon and companies like that were providing. And I know you're not an expert on oil, but I did have a question. I think it relates back to your saying we're going to have to leave some fossil fuel in the ground. You had that slide on oil reserves, and I wondered at what price, because, obviously reserves continue to change. If it's $100 a barrel, then we've got a lot more reserves than if it's at 50, and as renewables get less and less expensive, those oil reserves are not really very attractive. So I don't know if you know what figures were used for that graph.
Just proven reserves.
Yeah, this is just.
Saying they actually. No, it doesn't matter. They're just saying
Oh.
The geologists thought there was something in the ground.
Yeah.
Now we've proven it.
Yeah, they also produce curves that do take into consideration what you're saying. I don't have those in front of me, but the extractable, or how much is extractable at today's cost, and those are much smaller, of course, than these numbers.
Right, okay, so
Yeah.
this is just what's out there.
This is just what's
because
out there.
that's a pie in the sky then, depending on what the price is. Okay.
But it does serve as a driver to the price of oil. When new reserves are found, the price of oil goes down. So.
Hi there, my name's Mason. I do have a question for you, but I first want to address this gentleman's first question. To answer you, the U.S. currently uses about 4 terawatts of energy per year. And another example with energy projections, especially with solar, the explosive growth has historically far outpaced projections. For example, the Energy Information Agency made a projection for late 2050s back in 2012, and we've already surpassed their projection here in 2017. So it was very understated. And my question for you is, I heard you mention commercial solar and residential solar, but you didn't mention community solar, and what role do you see community solar playing in the larger field of solar energy?
Well, I think it's a very important area. I had it in my concluding slide, but you're right, I didn't get into that very much. But that's clearly a growing phenomenon where communities decide that they want to just have their own power system and be independent, well, not necessarily independent of the grid, but be not reliant completely on the grid. And that's a growing phenomenon. Communities, there's a broad definition of what constitutes a community. But, and so, for example, it can be just a small neighborhood, or it can be a whole city, I guess. But it's a very important role, and it's going to be a combination of rooftop and central station, or large-scale rooftop and individual rooftop systems. And that may be the reason why the Solar Power Europe sees a growth in the residential, because they may see that as being driven by community power programs.
For the people here who might not know, could you define community solar?
Can you? Maybe, because my understanding is that it's the collection of a community of people that want to have solar available to them, even if they cannot put even if they don't have their own roof. So in other words, if you have a big apartment complex, well, and China's a good example of this, where there are very few individual home owners there, but there are large apartment complexes with a lot of rooftop space. So the idea is to come up with programs, investment programs, to put solar on the apartments and give everybody access to that solar through some mechanism. Is that kind of the way you see it? Yeah.
I'll just add, also called solar gardens. And in Golden, the city is going to, subject to the vote on Proposition 2A, that everybody in Golden should vote yes on, is going to have a community solar or solar garden that then residents can buy in if their houses are too shaded or they're in an apartment and don't have a place for their own. So community solar is a shared resource, but you kind of buy so much of the resource as a citizen, and then that feeds back to your individual utility bill as a credit. Thanks.
Is that going to be socialized electricity?
I'm not going to call it socialized or not. Shared is a good word.
Hi, I'm Adam Carlson. I work in the solar department for Tesla, and I saw one of your slides. You were talking about solar farms and where the costs are going. So you said that PV, like the actual cells are going to remain stable, and you were kind of showing some areas where there's some decreases in costs. Specifically what I was seeing inverters, which makes a ton of sense. Hardware installation, stuff like that. Now, with what we have going on in the next 5 years, so what you mentioned before, we have tariffs that are most likely coming on the cells, on the modules, which are just going to rise costs across the board. That's just what they do. So you have that coming soon. So PV, solar installations costs are going to go up. Then you have the ITC, the 30% federal tax credit, for those of you who aren't aware, starting to step down. It's 30% now, 2020 goes down to 26%, 2021 goes down to 24%, and it goes down to 0. Except for commercial, it's going to stay at 10% after that. So now this is for solar farms. Now, do you have any idea of how exactly the solar industry is going to be able to outpace those increases in costs? Because now, when you have the tariffs, and then you have these systems now being more expensive since you don't have the tax credit since those are expiring.
Well, that's a good question. I think that's the key question. And obviously, this analysis probably doesn't reflect any of those changes in policies that are coming down the line. This is sort of a global average number anyway.
For sure.
Yeah. But, I don't have, I think this is the whole political side of the argument that is really going to need a lot of our attention. Because I don't think that, unfortunately, we have an administration that doesn't seem to really even understand how the solar market works at all. And they have a lot of emotional feelings about China. And so that's really working against us. And I know that when Abigail spoke to us a couple of weeks ago at SPI, this is a number one priority for SEIA to be addressing, is that tariff. Because a couple of years ago, we weren't sure if it was going to go forward. But at any rate, and if the tariff goes in and the industry starts to lose its momentum, then prices are going to go up because demand is still going to be, or because its supply is going to be more limited.
Yeah.
So it's going to have a negative effect that's really harmful.
And I'm still not even sure what's going to happen with Tesla, because we have the 2 gigafactories that are coming online, but I still haven't gotten the obligatory email from Elon. Not just me, everybody, but regarding what's going to happen for us, because I'm not sure if those cells are going into just the shingles or if they're going to the panels. So yeah, so far I haven't heard anything about it on any side, but yeah, I don't know. I'm hoping that at least we're going to be able to do something, and then once Trump's out of there, then maybe the tariffs go away.
Maybe the U.S. market or maybe the U.S. manufacturing capacity will ramp up as a response to that. That's the hope, of course. But there's going to be a several-year delay before that can come back online.
Absolutely.
Next will be Ron Larson.
Dave, nice talk. Could you put the slide up on storage? Where is the synthetic natural gas coming from?
I'm not really sure.
Usually when you see these slides, it's only batteries.
Yeah. That's for the, it's kind of hard to read this, but that's, I don't think that's anything that's commercially out there right now, but that's, you're looking for ways to provide long-term storage in the grid. Like we're looking at, no, that's not quite right either. I don't know. This is a Fraunhofer study. That's why I was focusing on the first 4, because those are the ones that I think are commercially. Yeah. Well, this came out of the Global Futures report. It's a separate report, not the status report. But it's actually a Fraunhofer study that was done. And so I have a feeling that it's probably technologies that aren't necessarily being explored much in the U.S., but could be explored elsewhere.
Yeah, KK has written a very definitive book on energy and energy law, a history, which is dramatically good. I recommend it.
Great.
It's called Energy Law Basics, but all of those technologies, the synthetic natural gas and the hydrogen, those are for hydrogen fuel cells, so they are anticipating that those are technologies that are going to ramp up more. Everything else is currently already being used, like the pumped hydro storage is the main storage used right now, which is why it's up high on there, even though maybe it costs more. A few places are using that compressed air energy storage, like in caves. And then, obviously we have flywheels and batteries still coming. So.
If you think the upper right is potentially bio?
I don't, not your biochar, not that I know of. It should be.
It won't be biochar, no.
Yeah, I think it's that they're using it to create, I think, transportation fuels.
Or maybe hydrogen fuel cells.
Well, that's what the hydrogen is, definitely. But the synthetic natural gas, I think they're just using that power to create synthetic fuels.
Well, unless it's the component, the catalyst that you need for the hydrogen fuel cell. That's what I was wondering. Yeah, not either.
Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. Great. Hopefully this will be pretty quick, but so one of your first slides you said there's going to be an increase in like 2035 and then hopefully that decline again to 2050. Could you describe a little more of what that increase is about and if that kind of includes us on the way to the decrease, if that's like we need that increase to supply the these mechanisms?
The increase, is it this one? That the one you're thinking?
Yeah, that one, or I think the one
Or this
before
one, or
the,
this one?
yeah, that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, realistically, we're still, our use of fossil fuels is still growing. Not so much in this country or in Europe, but in the developing world. It's growing still quite rapidly. Even in China, even though they have such strong policies for renewables, the demand for automobile fuel and for coal plants is still going up. India, China is still building a lot of coal plants, South America. So realistically, and once you make those investments, those technologies are going to be around for 40 years. So they're factoring that into the, there's a lot of momentum in the system that has to get reversed. But that momentum is going to continue on an upward track for at least another 20 or 30 years. That's why even the most aggressive scenario, they have to acknowledge the fact that we can't just shut it down today. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important question because, you don't want people to give up hope, and you also have to be really based on what the facts are. So I don't know if you've looked carefully at what's going on with India and China with their coal supplies. You can build a coal plant, but if it doesn't have coal, then it's not going to burn coal. And also just, they're backing down their coal a lot. China's going gangbusters on both wind and solar, and India's coming along very nicely. So I don't think the IPCC in the last report really took a hard look at that, and a lot has changed. So I don't know if you've taken a hard look, but I'm seeing a lot of good signs out of China and India, and that we're still in trouble. But
yeah, there are a lot of good signs, but nevertheless, when you build a coal plant, you're going to, you're building it to be able to use it for 40 years, and so.
if you don't have the coal, you can't use it.
Well, they have the coal though. Well, okay, they do.
I read about it every day. There's coal supply constraints in China and India every day.
But that's more of a distribution than a supply problem. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think the point still remains. There's a lot of momentum in the current track that we're on, and you're just not going to turn it around overnight.
This gives a great opportunity to say we will recess to the South Commons, where we can carry a lot of individual one-on-one, two-on-three, and thank Dr. Renné again.